So hello everyone, I'm here with our artistic director Paul Hillier and composers David Fennessy and Tarik. We thought it would be quite nice just to have a little chat. We're coming from 4 different countries, 2 continents, vastly different time zones. So Tarik needs to stock up on coffee, and that's perfectly acceptable. Excellent. So Paul, I might actually just start off with you. Obviously, we've worked with Tarik a lot, we've worked with David a lot, and we commissioned these pieces of David. And your reaction, I suppose, to getting the disc and hearing it and seeing it and all of that, finally.
Well, I haven't listened to the disc yet, to be quite honest.
It's harsh.
I'm always looking forward. I've listened to all of it, obviously, in great detail as we were editing it, and listening to then the supposed final version that may then have had some more little bits done to it. So I feel I know what's there, almost better than I want to. But it's like that with every record. When the actual disc comes, I kind of look at it and say, oh, that looks nice. So what should we do now? So for me, recordings are very quickly move into the past. Maybe I'm saying the wrong things here, but I think that, first of all, I was very happy with the way the recordings went. They were 2 very different projects, because of course Tarik's piece has a chamber orchestra hanging on and playing lots of notes, so it's a very different kind of overall situation. And then David's pieces are a cappella, and each one of them is radically different, really, from the other. And yet with this connection going through that perhaps he can talk about in the middle, but in a moment. But so it's again, it's the process of putting something together, and then finally when it's made, that's it. You don't need to worry about it anymore. And even if you do, it's too late. But I like to have this. This is what I like about recording, is that you actually make something. I mean, performing live in concert is very important, but the process of recording has a different purpose behind it, and I enjoy it in every way that it's different from giving a concert, even though you have to pretend when you're recording that you are giving a concert, so you have the right kind of feeling of spontaneity, and not the 20th time you've done this bit, that kind of thing. So yeah, there's that huge difference between recording and performing live, which of course is something else we can talk about at the moment, because there's not a lot of live performance going on. But there we are. So anyway, I'm very happy with what we've got. I'm sorry I haven't actually listened to the copy that you sent me. It's because I have every confidence that it's magnificent.
Excellent. Well, we'll let
over to you.
We'll let you off with that for a little while.
Thank you.
What about you, Dave? Because I know you listened a couple of weeks ago there.
Yeah, and actually, I also thought, oh, all right, this is something that maybe I can. It took me a while to get around to have the right spot, because obviously when you go through the editing process too, and then you're listening in a different way, I think. You know, you're really trying to be objective and still creative, actually. I mean, there's always a chance, you always feel as a composer right until the last second before you send something out where you're like, I can just make this perfect. So there was so you're still trying to tweak things and stuff. So actually it was only really, the other day that I finally sat down and listened to it. And actually only this morning that I finally got the time to listen to Tarik's piece, actually all the way through as well. And it's, I think it's a beautiful document. I mean, I think it's a very kind of, I don't know, maybe it's pretentious, but a kind of truthful document of what those pieces are like. And it's funny what Paul's talking about, and this really goes to Preben, who recorded them, that I think that this space that they occupy in the recordings is very similar actually to how they feel live, which I think is a real testament to a good recording. So you really feel kind of close to something and in the middle of something, if you know what I mean. So the kind of the shape around it is very immediate, and so yeah, I mean it's quite a big meal to the whole CD, you know. And it's a kind of a game of two halves, you know. You can suggest, like, you know, taking a break between Tarik's and mine. So yeah, no, I must say I'm really delighted with how it's turned out.
Excellent. And Tarik, what about you? I know you've listened through to it as well.
Oh yeah, I adore this recording, and it's probably slightly different for me because I this was recorded over 2 years ago, and I think that's the interesting thing, that the two pieces were recorded years apart. Is that right? I think so.
Yeah.
And yet, you know, following on from what Dave's saying, they're very different works that somehow, in what Chamber Choir Ireland and Paul and Irish Chamber Orchestra and Prebin as well have done, is somehow created a very coherent whole, not just in terms of the subject matter, but the feel and the space of the album. And it's just, you know, amazing to hear these two very different works that, in my mind at least, require a sort of curious blend of, you know, extreme precision and extreme clarity and crispness, actually, I think, with regard to the textural effects that both Dave and I work with, and also that I think there's a very strong sense of drama and narrative drama across both works. So you need that sort of immediacy, but coupled with it's that rarest of things, I think, which is this incredible warmth of sound. And, you know, often one might hear recordings that go one way or the other, and there's something really extraordinary when I first started listening, you know, to the album, is that exact balance between the two, and it really is. It carries you throughout the whole album, and it's odd, yeah. If you haven't heard something for years, you know, we all have legendary performances that we think of in our mind, or things like that. And I remember the recording of my piece thinking, this is really, really good. This is going to be really good. And then, you know, years later, you think, was I, you know, just sleep deprived? Was it really good? And then you hear it and you think, oh yeah, no, it was really, really good.
And actually, that's something that you're always kind of worried about in a way, isn't it? I remember, like, recording the last of the three of mine for various reasons. We ended up going very late into the night. There was, I can't remember, there was a generator or somebody was doing building work next door, and then we had to stop. And so it ended up being this kind of epic thing, and it was really late into the night, and it felt really charged. I remember the atmosphere at the end, trying to get the last piece down, and you're just, in a way, it's, in fact, I mean, that's a year ago, almost exactly a year ago since we did ours, actually. You're kind of thinking, I really hope we can capture some of that electricity, you know, in the recording, because, you know, I listen to that recording and I still think of the time when we recorded it. Of course, nobody else picks up on those things at all. So it's funny, this kind of question of distance, isn't it?
And the recordings are artifacts. I mean, they are there's, in the best way, they are, you know, artificial captures, in a sense, of a moment. And it is, and they always have been. And I think there's something actually quite magical in that, when you, as the creator of the work, and maybe, you know, I would think Majella and Paul also feel this, that you're sort of in on the secret. Exactly what you're saying. You've got not only a mental image of what happened, but also, I presume it's what an editor of a movie feels like. You know where, you know, all the secret things have happened behind the scenes, and it's something. I don't know. I find it personally, you know, very powerful when you can listen to a recording and you know that's there, but somehow there's a cohesiveness to it, and you are in a sense tricked as the creator of the work. You yourself are tricked somewhat when you hear the thing. So I absolutely love it. I think it's really, really good. I say that absolutely from the bottom of my heart. It's a stunning album.
Certainly my response to it, being sort of behind, you know, and just very much involved in the sort of creating the booklet and getting that sort of stuff, and it certainly was one of the more positive things for Chamber Choir Ireland during lockdown, was that it actually gave the space. We had things sort of in motion just before lockdown started, so it actually gave a real drive to sit down and do it properly and get that sorted. And I think we were really blessed by the two sets of images that we were able to use in the cover book, in the sleeve notes, both of the Emma Hauk image and then the Magna Carta image as well. And it struck me actually as we placed them beside each other that they're very similar. The Magna Carta is very neat and ordered, but actually there is this sort of dense text element that kind of went through it all. But
well, that's the thing that I was really struck by listening to Tarik's piece today. And Tarik, I mean, congratulations. It's really, I mean, it's a really, as a journey, I mean, the really, really big feel of a journey by the end of that piece. It's really quite an impressive work. So congratulations on it. I was really, I mean, I hadn't realized quite how much they did have in common, actually. And there's this whole notion of the parchment in Tarik's piece, which is a really, you know, a lift-off point for me, because it's very unusual actually for me and my work to actually respond to a visual stimulus. That's actually almost never really happened for me in other pieces, but that was really the starting point for me of all of that stuff, was that seeing that image of the Emma Hauk text the first time, and because it kind of suggested musical ideas and stuff. And it's funny when you see them on the back of the CD, the two of the liner notes, like you're saying, those two, and it's actually not even the image, but it's the paper on which they're printed. But actually is almost really where Tarik's piece takes off from, that notion, really. So it kind of it really and it's the same for me, because it's, and the idea of the medieval Japanese text, which is at the end, was actually also to do with the paper on which, because there's so much white and space in that I really wanted to show this absence of all the text and stuff. So it's a kind of, there are a lot of threads that run across the whole thing that I think makes sense now.
Maybe it would be a good idea just to sum up in your three pieces, David, just how they are not related to each other, but what they do that's different, and also talking about the actual physical object of the writing and the thing that it's written upon. Because if anything goes through both all your pieces and Tarik's piece, it's that element of texture and reality, writing not just as something abstract, but as something physical in a physical place.
Yeah, I mean, there's some. So the first time when I encountered the writing of Emma Hauk, which has a kind of you know, there's an extreme kind of energy, which is just visual, you know, you can see immediately from the page, this overwriting and, you know, many thousands of times the same words overwritten, even if you don't really know what they're saying, or even if you don't know what the story is. There's this kind of idea of the superimposition of a thought, and it's kind of clear that it's the mental state that produces that is quite extreme too. So it kind of lent itself in a way immediately to a musical kind of expression, I suppose. And as you know, that piece was originally, that was going to be the piece, and I was going to write, and I wrote a short piece, and actually it was yourself, Paul, who kind of, you know, immediately, I remember it suggested that, felt like it was the story wasn't done, or that it would maybe kind of prized something open rather than being a closed thing. And I went off and I thought about that a lot, and I had some other ideas. And actually also for me, that piece was very important personally, because it opened up a way of writing for voices for me that I had kind of considered closed, because it had been 10 years since I'd written for choir before that. And I had, trying to find texts and sources that really in a way of vocal expression that I could somehow marry with the way that I was thinking about instruments and stuff as well, a very tactile experience from the listener's point of view. So this particular text really opened up a lot of things for me, where it was one word that had it was a really, a bodily experience to make the sound. So that was, trying to find the sound of that piece it's almost, in some ways, from my point of view, a kind of quite like an instrumental piece in some ways, the way that I'm trying to use the voices in that piece, so that there's kind of different layers, but each individual layer has got its own approach to that instrument, the instrument being their voice. And, and I was interested also in using the 16 members of the choir and kind of being able to hear even the nuanced differences between, let's say, the 4 soprano voices, even when they're singing the same material. So all of those things fed into something and opened up lots of thoughts then that kind of spilled over into the next pieces. And, that there is a kind of a journey there through a kind of a mental state, really, if you will. So that first one, which is to do with, I guess, yearning and looking forward and expectation and desire and desperation. And the second piece is really to do with this idea of the absolute present tense, a kind of consciousness, which is in a state of awakeness, or constant having just woken. And again, I'd read various texts and books about real experiences that real people had of that. And I guess that was something that became important for me in terms of looking for the text, that they were texts which at the time were not created as works of art, but were the sometimes unconscious product of a kind of direct emotion, so that they were never, people weren't writing those things with the idea that somebody at some point, however tens or hundreds of years later, might set it to music. And also similarly in the last piece, it's a piece of graffiti in one sense, and actually only in the end, is at the very end, so I guess after almost a half an hour of music, is some poetry actually set in the piece. And so in a way, that's a more sophisticated form of expression in some ways. And I guess for me, that's a kind of coalescing of all the things that have happened up to that point, which is this Arashina Nikki, this more ancient Japanese text, which is backward looking and reminiscing, and there's a kind of slightly mournful air of those things which have been lost. So, and in some ways, over the years of writing those pieces and working on them, they also coalesced in my mind into all occupying maybe one consciousness. It could all be one point of view, just from or one ego, if you like, that it occupies. So it's many voices split, but in some ways it's also one voice for me, which is carried all the way through the pieces. Yeah,
and Tarik, I mean, you went through a completely different process in a way, because you had a librettist, and a very well-known librettist, which had its own very interesting aspect for me to be doing a piece that had been created in that way. How did that all work out? I mean,
it worked very well. It was very much
certainly.
Sorry?
Certainly it did, but
well, I mean, I worked with Alice Goodman, who is a poet and librettist, who I still think is the case. I think has, before working on this piece, had only worked with John Adams on first Nixon in China, then Death of Klinghoffer. And, you know, it's a very, biographies of composers and operas and things are full of acrimonious exchanges between librettists and composers. So it's a very strange and trusting relationship, but really, really we just got on very well and had a lot of fun writing the piece, which was a commission from Salisbury Cathedral to mark the 800th anniversary of Magna Carta, and Salisbury Cathedral holds one of the 4 original copies that are still knocking around. And I think the fun we had was that it could have been a very dusty, dry, boring journey through, you know, I don't know, legalese and stuff. But Alice and I both hit on the same thing at the same time, which is the majority of Magna Carta has been repealed. So, you know, it's very important, but most of it has been repealed over the years. In fact, there's only a couple of clauses left in it that are still in British law. Obviously, it's hugely important to the history and development of law, but we focused on these 2 clauses, 39 and 40, which we would, certainly the Americans would call the right to due process, which is a very interesting time to be talking about the right to due process in the United States. And we didn't plan it, obviously, this way. I'm sure he didn't plan to release this album, this particular period in American history, but it's very good. And so, you know, this idea that it is important to, not only important to be protected by civil rights, but that you are also aware of those rights, that they are a functional part in which order is maintained and civil liberties are maintained, which the most famous version probably that most people know in various movies is when you're warned that you have a right to remain silent, which is the first step in this informing of one's rights. But the thing to remember with Alice is that she's a poet, and what she wrote was a poem. And in the way that she's very, having worked as a librettist, I think is very aware that there are inherent rhythms in text as a poet, which with the best will in the world, the composer's going to mess around with. She was very open to me physically moving things around the page to create the dramatic structure that I wanted from the poem. And we went back and forth to create something that worked for us both dramatically. And so by really focusing on this one idea of due process and really focusing on the process act of it, part of it, that law is a process, she hit upon the idea that which we use, and I think also links very strongly with Dave's amazing triptych, which is this refrain that texts are acts. They are, and that's the key to certainly to our piece, that they're not just words on a page. They are acts. There's a reason for something to be written down. There is a physical act of writing something down. And Alice used this really to begin thinking about 2 things running concurrently: the sequence of words that were fought between competing parties 805 years ago to get those words down in the document, but also the physical act of making parchment, of marking parchment, and the fact that parchment comes from an animal, and in order for that parchment to be made, that animal must be killed. The idea that the ultimate act of a text begins with the sacrifice, this idea that you're sacrificing a living thing to create this document. So for me, when I saw all of that, for me, the work was very much about poise, the poise of the calligrapher, the poise of the parchmenter, the poise of legal jurisprudence, the poise of argument. And so the whole piece, musically for me, became this balancing act that I know that I wanted to expand this idea of sort of making a mark, and that the piece is a sort of musical rendering of that act. Instead of lasting 1 second, it lasts 40 minutes, and so it has that overarching palindromic sense. And then within each of those, it's in multiple sections, and in each of those sections there are sort of mirror images, and so it feels like one of those sort of hanging, to me when I wrote it, one of those sort of mobiles that are sort of hanging, like those Calder sculptures, where there's an overall sculpture, but within each one there are independent movements that have their own balance and poise. And really that was the sort of the whole idea of the work, and also the balance between the voices and the orchestra, the instrument. That there's not this idea of one being accompanied by the other, that's not the goal of the work, but that there are various permutations and combination of line from soloists, which may be instrumental or vocal, to everyone working together, to strong unisons and things, really sort of exploring the idea of balance in terms of voice, instrumental and vocal. And yeah, I mean, it's going back to sort of hearing the album, and I don't normally fanboy other composers, but I wrote today because I was just completely bowled over, because I'd heard the first movement of the Triptych live. It's another thing where you think that was a good piece, and you think that was years ago, maybe it's not so good. So I heard it, I was like, oh my god, this is really, really good. And then hearing this, for me, hearing a triptych's a very tough thing to pull off, because you've got individual works, obviously, especially you're talking about a first work that was its own thing, and that's very similar to a thing that happened to me with a 3-part thing. I wrote the first movement thinking this is it, and so this idea of not just adding works but creating a whole that is its own thing is very, 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 it's a very hard thing to pull off, and you just do it utterly brilliantly, I think. And I think this thing that it's always fun to hear composers talk about other composers' work, because I can say what I want. You can just quietly, I can see the thought bubble coming. I go, what is he talking about? Oh dear, oh dear. But for me, it was this idea of act, that the text that you're working with are not simple abstract things. They are acts, and that drama and that you keep in each of the pieces and as a whole, I think is just really an incredible, it's just really an incredible journey that you take us on. And that felt very close to what I was in a totally different musical language, but that idea of narrative and drama being a sort of functional and important part of my work. So yeah, it's really nice to be to see all our names together on
Well, I mean, I'm embarrassed, obviously, but I'll also take the compliments, and I'm glad this is being recorded. But it's true. I mean, that's what I was also, that kind of question about the drama, or a particular kind of drama as well. And actually, I mean, there's obviously even formal things which are you know, kind of rhyme in a way in the pieces as well. There's a kind of cyclical thing that happens, and a returning to a point that's the same but actually completely changed at the end. And I'm just wondering, I mean, I think that that dramaturgy that you can have, I mean, I think that, I mean, maybe Paul could talk about that. I don't think that that's maybe typical of a way of choral writing, that actually I think both those pieces are kind of unusual in that regard, that I think that and you know, the thing that it really makes sense to me, what you're talking about, how you're this way that you use the strings. As I mean, I remember I was just listening today, and I mean, you know, I'll give you a compliment back, which is the biggest thing that I can give as a compliment to somebody. I was listening to the part, there's a lot of the time where you have the basses and the cellos are in the unison with the sopranos, and they do a kind of, and I was like, I'm having that. So expect to see that in a piece sometimes.
Well, I stole that from Prince.
But I love this way of augmenting the lines so that, yeah, it becomes like a kind of meta instrument. I thought that it's that's really clear and comes across. But I think that both of them are maybe, yeah, a bit unusual in that approach to choral writing, actually, in that way. I don't know, maybe what Paul thinks about it. I mean, if it's been done, Paul knows it for choir. I think we can say
well,
that.
I don't know. The thing is, a few years ago, I came to the conclusion that the problem with choral music is that you have all these settings of poems, which may or may not be beautiful and interesting, but they kind of expect the audience suddenly to get involved in something which is just a small little poem, and why should they? And then I thought, well, the best way to serve an audience is to tell them a story. It doesn't have to be once upon a time there was this and so on, but the idea of narrative suddenly became all important to me. And so I have been looking for pieces that have this quality in them. And I think probably that's what I responded to in your first piece, and why I thought let's take this further. And I mean, with Tarik's piece, you could say, well, it's all about this legal script and so on. But as Tarik just said, I mean, there's so much more to it than that. And again, it's the poem by Alice that has brought out the possibilities of that. So there is narrative, a narrative of a wider sort. There are other pieces that have narrative, of course, but that's why I deliberately tried to move away from just another poem about somebody feeling happy or sad or whatever, but with a kind of sense of direction behind it.
I think that's what has appealed to the audience so much about both pieces, and certainly, you know, I would talk to audience members, or I get emails, and certainly have had so many questions since we performed A Letter of Rights. Are you going to be recording that? People knew we recorded it for broadcast, and it went out on RT Lyric FM, and said, are you going to be releasing that? We'd really like to hear that again. I said, well, maybe, we'll see. And we knew we'd recorded it, and I thought, we just have to get it out now. But similarly with Dave's pieces, because obviously we commissioned them as individual works over a number of years. So our regular audience was kind of spoon-fed the pieces over a period of time. And I think the most striking one, and I can't remember which piece it was maybe the middle piece, Ne Reminiscaris, that we programmed that in a series of Bach motets. So we had a series of concerts where Bach motets were juxtaposed with other works. And one audience member said on the way out, I came for the Bach, but I've left wanting to hear the Dave Fennessy again. So, you know, just like the pieces that really struck the audience, and they want to hear it again, they want to hear more. So it's a testament within, I suppose, contemporary choral music, because contemporary music gets a bad rap that it doesn't attract big audiences and all the rest, but there's something about contemporary choral music, and I think just what Paul touched on, you know, it was bringing the audience into a narrative in these two pieces that really struck a chord.
It's interesting that the as you say, the narrative, which is what draws the audience, because I think both Dave and I have been liberated from the prison of intelligibility, being, you know, the sort of prison of clarity, that there must be, that every single syllable in sequence of the text must be presented syllabically, so that at any time the audience knows exactly where they are in the piece, and that that I think has problematized for me a lot of choral music, and it's become,
Absolutely.
and it's still an argument. I still get people saying, well, you've got, you know, multiple texts going on, or you're repeating a syllable, or you know, I lost track of the text, and for me, I just think, but you know, when we're here talking about narrative and drama, that's not a contiguous sequence of syllables. As you know, that's not narrative, that's not drama to me as the composer. And so I think it's really interesting to hear you talk about those connections with audiences, because I think it and I really hear it in Dave's work as well, this idea that you can be extremely clear in your narrative and drama without being beholden to, you know, for me, what is just, you know, this idea of, you know, logical, you know, sequence of syllables. I mean, the text is always, the poem's always the poem, or the text's always there. It's always there. I haven't done anything to it. It's still there. You know, I haven't ripped it up. So for me, that's another thing that I think I find quite compelling about the linking of these two works is that we let go of that, and it can feel like a prison. You know, you just let go of that issue.
Well, I think we'll probably wrap things up, but I do think listeners will have a real treat in store. As Dave said, it is a meal, and probably a little a little break in the middle, but it is a wonderful listen, and we were delighted also to work with the Arts Chamber Orchestra, who are a phenomenal group of musicians, and it's always a lot of fun working with them, but it's always great music with them as well. So thank you for everything that's gone into this, because it's it's a lovely thing.
Thank you, Paul, Majella, and the choir. I mean, just, you know, I can't imagine a more, you know, as it's a bit of it sounds a bit cheesy, but a more supportive environment to, you know, listening to Tarik talk about freeing ourselves in a way. I just don't think I would have been able to even think like that hadn't I been afforded the opportunity to do it, really. You know, I remember sending a sketch of my first piece to Paul and saying, you know, the choir's divided into 16 parts. Is that okay? Paul was like, well, you know, and you could see that it was the right thing to do for the piece. I don't think he was thrilled at the start, but, you know, it's a kind of, there is a bit of a sense for me, you know, if you get given the keys to a Ferrari, you don't go driving at 10 miles an hour, you know what I mean? It's a kind of, so for me, that was a liberation as well, you know, that to be even feel like I could actually, you know, write in that way. So I really genuine thanks to both you and to the choir for everything. Great. Well, thank you all, and on we go. Okay. Take care. Bye.